Throughout the hobby of model railroading, there are many modelers who dislike Bachmann, mainly due to their prices, their gear problems, and their overall quality. However, I don't really think Bachmann is as bad as many people, sometimes including myself, make it out to be. I, personally, am not the most fond of Bachmann. However, as of now, I mostly just joke about it with friends and whatnot, and I'm not too serious about hating them. They are not the worst brand in the world, and there are a few things that they actually do really well. One of those being their parts availability. I have had really good luck with Bachmann and their parts. I have been in many situations where I've needed a part and I just cannot seem to find it or anything that would work, and I go on Bachmann's website and go through their parts catalog, and they have a few different options that I can actually use for some of this stuff. I've got two engines right here that I've actually used parts from their parts store in. While the shipping on their parts is usually quite expensive, it has actually saved this Jupiter, for one. I could not locate a drive shaft for this thing, went on their parts store, and they had them for relatively cheap, so I got a few of them, and now this engine, due to Bachmann's good availability with their parts, has a functional drive shaft. I've noticed many different model railroading companies, especially Athearn, is really bad at this, not having a really good catalog of parts. There's some that definitely do, and some that you can easily reach out to, but I found that Bachmann is just really easy to get parts from if you need them, and you can find just about anything for most models. Another one that I've actually used some parts in is this GE 70 tonner. This one was an engine I got for free. It had cracked gears, and I actually found, just going through Bachmann's parts catalog, that I could replace the original trucks on this thing with trucks of a newer generation 70 tonner, which this locomotive now possesses. These don't have the gear cracking issues of the earlier ones as far as I'm aware, and for the past, I believe, 3 years at this point, this thing has served me really well, and I've not had many issues at all with it. It pulls some short trains pretty well on the club's layout, and it's a pretty fun locomotive with a fun story behind it. Another thing I think Bachmann does really well is their Silver Series rolling stock line. Here I've got two cars, and these are two that I really do quite like. The first of which is this little ore car. I don't know exactly how long this is, and this load is not original, but I've had these things for several years now, and despite being just your basic Bachmann car, I recently put Katie's on these things, but they have had their original couplers, everything original for several years, and they have served me really well. The only problem with these ore cars is that they're a little bit underweight, but I just added a tiny bit of weight to them, and they run perfectly. So far I have 5, and I kind of want to get a few more because these are relatively cheap, at least that I can find online in train stores and stuff like that. I've seen them for around $15 sometimes, which for a car with metal wheels and a decent knuckle coupler. I know Easy Mates aren't the best in the world, but they do have sprung Easy Mates, which are not that terrible. It's really not a bad deal. And even more than the ore carts, I really do like these 40-foots. They have a really good weight to them. Again, they use the same couplers and metal wheels as the rest of the Bachmann Silver Series stuff. And these things run really well. I've probably had 6 or 7 of these at this point. Most of them I've gotten rid of just because they don't look the greatest. This one actually looks pretty good. It's a little bit shiny, which is a problem that these 40-foot boxcars from the Silver Series line usually have, but these things work really well. I've rarely ever had any issues with any of these, none that I can actually recall. They've served me really well, and usually I just replace them when I get a higher quality car, which again, these are more like 18-ish dollars I've found, but it is not a terrible price for the level of quality they have, even for Bachmann. And while Bachmann's MSRP is kind of high on them, they're pretty cheap online and through a lot of train stores, so if I find some for relatively cheap, I'll buy a few from time to time, just because they've served me pretty well. Another type of Bachmann product that I do really like are their resin buildings. While many manufacturers, including Bachmann, just have basic plastic and plastic kits for their buildings, these are actually made of resin, and I do quite like them. This is the only one I've had, but I've seen a few others on other people's layouts, and they actually seem pretty good. This one's held up. I actually have this one because it's kind of an inside joke with my family. It's relating to a TV show we like, so it's just kind of neat to have around. These things do their job pretty well, and for what they are, they're, I believe, 30-ish dollars, something like that, which is kind of about where I see most other HO scale buildings, which is not that bad. They aren't the highest level of detail, but they're pretty easily customizable, and I do like how the windows on this thing are glazed. It is actually quite nice, and it's kind of hard to tell that there is not anything inside of here, and it makes it pretty easy to light. So while, again, these aren't the highest quality things out there, I do think that these are pretty neat, and they're just kind of fun pieces to have around, especially a building like this. I also like how Bachmann has a wide range of small motorized vehicles that you can buy. A lot of other manufacturers do not make anything at all like this, and stuff like speeders, hand carts, high rails, stuff like that are something that I hear a lot of other model railroaders say they would like to have, and have heard some comments like that about my stuff when I run it at the club I am part of. And I do think these things are pretty great. Like, for example, the speeder. While it's a little bit oversized, not the most detailed thing, the drivetrain is not that crazy, you can't really put DCC in this thing, but it's a really neat piece, and I don't know of any other HO scale manufacturer that's ever made a functional speeder. You've also got the same thing with the Gandy Dancer. It's just this little hand cart that people seem to love. I've got this one. It does not run the greatest because it's got a gear issue, which is one of Bachmann's downsides in some areas, but it runs fine as it's a small unit. And I've also got this high rail bus. They've actually got some more modern pieces like this. I believe they have a Jeep, a van, and a work truck, and I also have a work truck and another bus on top of this one. This one is actually all-wheel drive, which is really nice. These things do run really well, and I do actually like them. They don't really have a need to pull anything, but they're weighted pretty nicely, they run really smoothly, and they give you a wide range of modifications that you can do, especially since they're unlettered. You can weather it, you could paint it, you could make it look like some specific railroad. You can do whatever you want with this thing. Have a fun time with it. But yeah, I really do like this line of small motorized units Bachmann has. Most of the time they run pretty well. They don't really have to pull anything, so many issues like some of their gear problems aren't as huge of a deal on these things, and they're just kind of fun pieces to have around. On a similar note, I do like how Bachmann focuses on early 19th century steam locomotives. Not many companies, especially in North America, make any of these things. I don't actually think anyone outside of Bachmann really makes these things, which is kind of neat. These things are relatively well known for their gear problems, but you can still find ones that are good, and they made some of these more recently that still have good gears, just like all of these things that I got pretty new, I believe all for free. First up is a DeWitt Clinton. These things, again, they're really nice. They're basic though, and especially for when these things were made, I know they started making the John Bull in the 80s. I have another one of these in much worse shape. These things still are pretty nice looking. You've also got the Lafayette. These are really well known for their gear problems. However, this one, everything's pretty fine. And also the John Bull. And this one especially because I've actually seen this thing in Washington, D.C., and it's kind of neat to have an old locomotive that you've actually seen, which I do kind of like. I wonder if there are any other model railroaders who have had the same thought, because seeing this thing in the Smithsonian is a thing that I'm assuming a lot of people have done, and I feel like this is something that quite a few people would want models of after seeing it. Finally, Bachmann's train sets are some of the easiest for beginners to find and get into. While I think Walthers and Athearn both have better train sets than a company like Bachmann, I think Bachmann's are just simply the easiest to get into because they're the cheapest out there, and they're the easiest to find on places like Amazon or in stores like Hobby Lobby that a lot of people, when they're first starting out, will go to find trains. Something like this is pretty cheap, and this is actually how I started. While these sets don't have the features that older Tyco sets and Lifelike sets and stuff like that had, they're just a basic loop of track with an engine, a few cars, and a caboose. They still serve as a pretty good intro point, and that is basically how I started out. This was my engine from my first train set that I still have. I don't know how much longer I will keep this thing, but I still have it years later. I think at this point it has been about 9 years. So this thing, even though it's cheap, not the highest quality, and as you can see, it's been pretty beaten, it has stood up to the test of time. And while these drive systems are not the greatest at doing that, this one is still around, and I think it's held up pretty well for its age. While Bachmann has their bright spots, I am pretty sure without a doubt that they are far from the best manufacturer out there. I've had my fair share of Bachmann problems with cracked gears, just unreliable engines, engines that do not perform how I want them to, and also just low quality products overall, and engines that generally annoy me. None of this relating to the engine on screen at all. Totally not. There is no relation there. But Bachmann really does have their bright spots, and I don't think everything they make is as bad as a lot of model railroaders will say it is. They're certainly not my favorite brand, but I will also not fully avoid everything they make, because as you've seen here, I do still have quite a few Bachmann products, despite the fact that I am far from fond of them.